Hello, I am Mark. In this video, I'll show you how you can integrate Mailchimp into a Laravel application. We are not going to use any pre-existing packages. We will have our own custom integration. The purpose of this tutorial is to teach you how to work with the Mailchimp API and to show you how the processes work behind the scene. To save time, I will not type out everything. I've created a demo project instead. The demo project is available on GitHub. You can find the link in the description of the video. I will show you how to set up the demo project, and then I will explain the code line by line. Before we get to the Mailchimp integration part of the video, we will install some software that we will need. For example, XAMPP, Git, and Composer. If you already have these software installed, you can skip that part of the video. In the description, I will provide timestamps as well. We will also spend some time on understanding how the demo project works. This video is actually a part of my Udemy course. If you want to learn how to integrate additional email marketing providers such as Sandy, Sendinblue, ConvertKit, and GetResponse, then please purchase my Udemy course. You will find the link to the course in the description. You can also contact me and I'll send you a coupon for the course. Before we can start working on our project, we have to install some important software. We will install XAMPP, which is basically a software package. Navigate to apachefriends.org in your browser. XAMPP is the most popular PHP development environment. This development environment includes Apache. Apache makes it possible for our local machine to act as a server. XAMPP also contains MariaDB, which is a relational database management system. We need MariaDB to create our database for the project. XAMPP also contains PHP and Perl. We won't do anything with Perl, but of course we will need PHP on our system. In this video, I'm going to install XAMPP on a Windows machine. I will simply click on the XAMPP for Windows button, and as you could see, the XAMPP installer downloaded automatically on my computer. A new tab also opened in my browser. But I can close this tab because this tab only informs me that my download will start automatically. However, the download is already complete, so I don't need this tab, and actually I don't need this tab either. I can just simply click on the installer to start installing XAMPP. You might need to wait for a while until this warning message pops up. We can disregard this warning message about the activated user account control. Just click on OK and the installer will continue. Click on Next. Here we can select the components or the software that we want to install. If we install everything, it will not take more than approximately 800 megabytes on our hard drive. I will install everything for the sake of simplicity. But if you don't want to install everything, you can just simply untick the components that you don't want to install. However, as a bare minimum, we need Apache, MySQL, PHP, and PHPMyAdmin. So don't untick those. If you're wondering where MariaDB is in this list, then believe me that it corresponds to MySQL in this list. We can actually think about MariaDB as a version of MySQL, so to say. Once you selected your components, click on Next. We can select the installation folder for XAMPP, but I will leave the defaults here, so I will click on Next. We can change the language, but English is perfect for me, so I will click on Next again. And I will untick this Learn More About Bitnami for XAMPP checkbox because I don't need to learn more about Bitnami, so I will click on Next. And finally, if I click on Next again, the XAMPP installer will start. It will take a while for XAMPP to get installed on your machine, but I will of course fast forward the video. After a successful installation, you should see this window. I want to start the control panel, so I will just simply click on Finish. It might take a few seconds, but the control panel should eventually show up. Let's confirm that actually MySQL or MariaDB and Apache services are working correctly. First, I will click on the Start button for the Apache service. The Apache module turned green, so it means that it is working. My local computer now can act as a web server. I will now start the MariaDB service. The MySQL module is green, so it means that my relational database management system is working. But in order to confirm that it is really working, let's click on the Admin button on the MySQL row. In your browser, you should see what basically I see. A new tab opened with the address localhost/phpMyAdmin. phpMyAdmin is basically an administration tool for MariaDB. On the right you see that indeed we have MariaDB, so our database server is MariaDB. And on the left side you see some databases that were already created for us automatically. For our demo project we will have to create a new database. Let's create a database for our project. Make sure that your MySQL and Apache services are running. Then click on the admin button in the MySQL row. If everything works correctly, then you are navigated automatically to localhost/phpMyAdmin. Creating a new database is very simple. On the left side, simply click on the New button here. This will add a new database. But before the new database is created, we have to give it a name, of course. The name of my database will be Sonic_emails. The default settings are fine for us, so I will just click on Create. Our new database has been successfully created. Of course, at this point it is empty. But don't worry, because a bit later we will add tables and data to our database. You don't have to call your database Sonic_emails, however, if you use a different database name, make sure you remember it. The next software we are going to install is Composer. Composer is a dependency manager for PHP. We need Composer to install Laravel itself and its dependencies. So we can just search for Composer in Google. And as you can see, we have this getcomposer.org link. So we can click on it. We can just go to download. And because I'm on a Windows machine, I will just use the Windows installer. If it's not a good option for you, you can just follow the installation guide on getcomposer.org. As you can see, it's nicely documented. However, I would like you to notice that PHP has to be installed in a computer already, and of course we did it. So we installed PHP through XAMPP. So if you are following my lead, so to say, then it will be totally all right for you. But if you are not following me, then make sure that you installed PHP. And as you can see, this installer will download Composer for you and set up your path environment, so you can simply call the Composer command from any directory. So let's just download and run the Composer setup.exe. Okay, it's already downloaded, so let's just click on it. And I will install it for all users. You can just click yes. And actually, I will not click this option, developer mode. It's completely fine for me if I just install Composer as it is. All right, so here you have to choose the command line PHP you want to use. Now, as you can see, I installed XAMPP. So I have XAMPP php.exe, and this is completely fine for me. But if you didn't use XAMPP, or for whatever reason, this is not the path for you for your php.exe, then make sure that you choose the correct php.exe file here. Okay, I will click on next. I don't need to use a proxy, so I will just click on next. And setup is now ready to download Composer and install it on your computer. Everything seems to be fine. So we have a PHP 8.0.1. This is the correct path for my php.exe, and I'm not using a proxy, so I can just click on install. And it seems everything is fine. However, you should check this information. You must open a new command window to use Composer for the first time, because your environment has changed and running programs may not be aware of this. If this does not work, you will have to do one of the following. Close all File Explorer windows, then open a new command window, or log off and log on again, then open a new command window. As a last resort, you may need to restart your computer. Now let me just click on next. And we are completing the Composer setup, so Composer has been installed, and I can click on finish. But we are not finished, so I just read you the information that we have to open a command line. So let me just open a command prompt. I will run it as an administrator. All right, and what I will put in is Composer -- version. So this should give me the Composer version that I have installed. And indeed, Composer version 2.0.9. This is the version that we installed, so everything is fine. But if it's not working for you, so if you cannot see this, then the best is to log off, log on, and restart your computer, and then open a command prompt as an administrator, and then retry this command. So composer -- version, and if you see this, or if you see your composer version, maybe you have downloaded a newer one already, then everything is fine with composer. Next, we are gonna install Git on our computer. Git is a version control system. We need it because our demo application is on GitHub. So when you have to clone our Git repository, of course, I will show you how to do that later, but it's important to have Git installed on your computer. Otherwise, you will not be able to pull or clone or, like copy our demo application onto your machine. So I will just search for Git in Google. And this is the first result, so you can just click on this one. And actually, I can just download this latest source release. So download 2.30 for Windows. However, you can also go to the downloads and download the GUI client. However, this is the simplest for me. As you can see, the download has already started. I'm downloading the 64-bit version for Windows. If the download doesn't start, you can click here to download it manually. And of course, there are other Git versions for Windows, so like 32-bit, whatever. But I think like Git should be really good at guessing your Windows architecture. So if everything is fine, you will have already downloaded the correct Git version or correct Git installer. So let me just click on it. Let's install. And actually, Git will ask you many questions during the installation process. However, I will always choose the default option. So I will just click on Next. This path is fine for me. Okay, so for me it already exists. Of course, I had to uninstall Git and then now I'm reinstalling it for you. So for me it's completely fine that we are installing into this folder, which already exists. Alright, so you can select the components here. Now, actually, I don't need a desktop icon, but you can get a desktop icon if you check this, but this is totally fine for me. Okay, the shortcut in the start menu. Okay, that's fine. And now you can change the default editor for Git. As you can see, you can choose Atom, Sublime, Visual Studio Code, whatever. Now Visual Studio Code is not installed on my computer. It will be later. However, using Vim is totally fine. All right, let's click on Next. Yeah, I will let Git decide, so we can adjust the name of the initial branch in new repositories, but I think it's totally fine if Git decides this for us. And Git from the command line and from third-party software, so we can adjust in the path environment, and I think that the recommended option is totally fine for us. Use the OpenSSL library, yes, this is fine as well. Check out Windows style commit Unix style line endings. You can change this, but I really don't think that you should. I mean, at least if you are following my videos, then this option should be perfect for you. We don't have to use the Windows default console window, so we are fine with the mini TTY. Yeah, we can fast forward or merge. So we are choosing now the default behavior for Git pull request, and this is completely fine. Actually, I don't Git credential helper. I don't really think that I'm using this, but I mean, this Git credential manager core should be fine for us, especially because this one is deprecated, and yeah, I don't think it matters if we choose none or Git credential manager core, but let's just stick with Git credential manager core. We can enable file system caching. And we don't need the experimental support for sudo console, so if you want you can select this option, but I will just go ahead and finally install Git. I don't think that there is any other installation process that asks you so many questions. Okay, and finally Git has been installed on our computer. Let's check if Git has been successfully installed on our computer, so I will just open a command prompt as an administrator. And the command that I'm going to run in is git -- version, and it should give me back the installed git version. Alright, git version 2.30.0.windows.2. Perfect. As you can see, this is exactly the version that I have installed. I'm going to install Visual Studio Code. And this is my favorite code editor. Of course, you are free to use another code editor, but if you're fine with Visual Studio Code, then you can just follow this video. So obviously I will just search for Visual Studio Code, and here is the first result. And I can just download the stable build for Windows. Alright, the download has started. It shouldn't take much time to download the whole installer. And we can just click on the exe file. Okay, we of course have to accept the agreement. You can click on next. This is fine for me, you know, the default destination or default path. If it's not, of course, you should adjust it. Click on next. Yeah, I'm fine with the start menu setting. And yeah, add to path. I will leave this option selected. I want to actually create a desktop icon. And yeah, I think this is totally fine. So I will click on next, and I can just quickly check my settings. Yep, it's fine. So I will just install. And after we are finished, we can launch Visual Studio Code. So we can click on finish, and if you don't untick this checkbox, then Visual Studio Code should start for you. And indeed, we see the welcome page. I can just close this one. I will start a new terminal. Actually, I'm not going to run any commands now, but what I wanted to show you is that I have Bash as my default terminal. You might have something else, and actually you should have an opportunity to choose between the terminals. So I recommend Bash, but of course, you know, if you have something else, then I think you already know what to do actually. What I would like to do is install some extensions, so it will be easier for us to develop a Laravel application. So click on this icon, and as you can see, I don't have any extensions installed. There are some recommended extensions, and these are totally fine, but I will not install these extensions, but I will show you which extension I will install first. I will search for the Laravel extension pack extension. Okay, Laravel extension. I think this is it, the third one from the top. No. Oh, second one from the top, sorry. Laravel extension pack. And as you can see, we will get debug support for PHP, this editor, config, .m file syntax. Now, these are not very important for us, I think, but what is important, IntelliFans, so code intelligence for Visual Studio Code, blade snippets, we can run artisan commands, we can go to views, so it will help us to navigate better in Visual Studio Code within our Laravel application if we get this installed. So I will install this one, which is actually, you know, a package of extensions, and there will be one other that I will install. Okay, all right, so these are installed for me, and let me just delete this. As you can see that these .env editor, config, and so on have been installed for me, and the only one that I want to install is this one, the PHP IntelliSense, so auto completion and refactoring for PHP. I'm used to this, so I will go ahead and install this one. All right, this has been installed as well. So it's here. So we have all our extensions installed. There is one other thing that I want to show you. So you can go to File, Preferences, Settings, and let's type IntelliFans.diagnostics. Now it might happen later in the course that IntelliFans will mark lines of code errors, which are actually not errors. And what I suggest is that you come to this IntelliFans.diagnostics options in the settings. And what you can do is to tick this box. So you can enable undefined class interface and trait diagnostics. Or what you can do is to untick this box, this undefined symbols. I believe that it should be unticked. So I think we are fine if both are unticked. We will not see any errors, but it might happen if it's not unticked. So if the undefined symbols is ticked, then it might happen that some lines of code will be shown to you as erroneous. However, they are not. So I believe this is the best way to go about in Telefon's. So I will just close the settings, and we are finished with installing Visual Studio Code. It's time to set up our project. For this, we'll need Visual Studio Code, so open it if you haven't done so. First, we will have to navigate to the htdocs folder. Click on File, and then Open Folder. Find the folder where you installed XAMPP. You should have a XAMPP folder somewhere. I didn't change the default installation location, so my XAMPP folder is on my C drive. Inside your XAMPP folder, you should have an htdocs folder. Double-click on it. We will use XAMPP to run the demo application. In order to do that, we have to put the project into the htdocs folder inside the XAMPP folder. You should already see some folders inside your XAMPP folder, but don't worry about these. What is important is that we will put all the project files here inside the htdocs folder. Make sure you're inside the htdocs folder and then click on Select Folder. I will close the Get Started tab. And for now, I will also close my terminal. As you can see, I'm inside the htdocs folder. Make sure that you're also inside the htdocs folder. We will clone or copy a Git repository into the htdocs folder. For this, we will need a terminal. Click on Terminal and then New Terminal. By default, I'm using the Bash terminal. If you'd prefer something different, you can click on this downward pointing arrow and you should have some options to choose from. It doesn't matter which terminal you choose, we can run the same commands in all of them. Now we have to navigate to the GitHub repository. This is where the code for the demo project is. The name of the demo project is email-marketing. Click on Code, select the HTTPS tab, and click on this button to copy the Git repository, or more like the URL of the Git repository. Now go back to Visual Studio Code and type the following command into the terminal: git clone, then a space, and then paste the address of the GitHub repository. With the git clone command, we will copy all the project files from the repository onto our local machine into the htdocs folder. It might take a while to copy everything, so I will press Enter to execute the command and fast forward the video. If the project was successfully cloned or copied, then you should see an email-marketing folder inside your htdocs folder. All the code we have for the demo project is inside the email marketing folder. Let's open this email marketing folder in Visual Studio Code. So click on File, Open Folder, and I have to navigate to my XAMPP folder. I'm actually already in my XAMPP folder, so I have to choose the htdocs folder, and then I have to double click on the email marketing folder and click on Select Folder. I have successfully opened my email marketing folder. Make sure that you have opened the same folder that I have, and then we can move on. Make sure that the email marketing folder for our demo project is open in Visual Studio Code for you. You should see a .env.example file. Click on it and rename it to .env. So basically just delete the .example part. In Laravel projects, we store very important information in the .env file. We can define a name for our application in the env file. I gave the name Sonic Emails to the demo application. Each Laravel project needs an app key to work. I already provided a valid app key for you. We also have to define a URL for our project. Because we are using XAMPP and we are developing the demo application on our local machine, this URL will be, of course, localhost. When we run the demo project, you will see that actually the URL will be http://localhost/email-marketing, but later we will see this. These lines are extremely important in our env file. This is where we have to provide all the information for our database connection. Because we are using MariaDB, our DB connection variable has to be MySQL. Our database host is 127.0.0.1. This IP address actually stands for localhost. We don't have to touch the default DB port, so 3306 will be good for us. However, we have to provide a database name here. The name of my database is Sonic_emails. If you gave a different name to your database, then of course provide that name here. I'm using the default user here, the root user, and I didn't provide a password for it. For the demo project, this is fine, but in production, make sure that your user is always password protected. The demo project is still not ready to run, but we have finished editing the env file, so if you haven't saved it, then save it, and then we can move on to the next step. It's time to use Composer to install the dependencies of our demo project. For this, we will need to open a new terminal and run a command. Before we run the command, I want to clarify that at this point, our project is not actually a Laravel project. So far, we have cloned a Git repository, so basically we just copied some code onto our local machine, and we edited the .env file. These are of course very important steps, but still Laravel is not installed for this project. We need Composer to actually install Laravel for our demo project, and of course the other dependencies. The command that we have to run is composer install. If you've worked with Composer, you know that there are different commands that you can run for installing the dependencies. For example, composer update is also a valid command. However, I suggest you run composer install. This command, so the composer install command, makes sure that you will have the same dependencies with the same versioning that I'm using. If you run a different command, for example, composer update, then most probably your dependencies will have a different version than my dependencies. So if you want to make sure that you are using the same dependencies and the same versions that I use, then run the composer install command. This will take some time, so I will press enter and fast forward the video when we are done. We have successfully installed the dependencies of our project, so now we actually have a Laravel project, but still there is one more step to take before we could launch our demo project. The last step to take before launching the demo application is to seed our database. It basically means to add some data to our database. Open your XAMPP control panel, make sure that the MySQL and Apache services are running, and then in the MySQL row, click on the admin button. This should take you to phpMyAdmin automatically, so the URL should be localhost/phpMyAdmin. You should see here the database that we created, the Sonic_emails database. I will click on it. And actually what we can see is that no tables found in database, so this is an empty database so far. We will, however, use Laravel to automatically add or seed some data to this database. So we don't have to manually create our tables here in phpMyAdmin. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. In the File Explorer on the left, the email marketing project should be open for you. And if so, you should see a database folder. Let's click on it. And it also has a seeders folder inside, so let's click on that as well. These are the files that will help us seed our database. For example, there is the users table seeder, which will automatically seed or create two users in our database, the admin user and a member user. These two users will be added to the users table in our database. But of course there is no users table, there is no table in our database. But don't worry, because of course this users table will be automatically created. Before seeding our database, we will have to migrate our database. Above the seeders folder, there is the migrations folder. Click on it. Now these are the files that will drive our migration. For example, on top we have this createuserstable.php file, and this is the file that we will use to create the users table in our database. As you can see, based on the code, our users table will have an ID column, a name column, a username column, and so on and so on. In Laravel, we can run a single command to migrate our database and then seed it. Migrating a database basically means that we create or edit the tables of our database. Make sure that you have a terminal open. If you don't have one, then click on Terminal and New Terminal. Type the following command: php artisan migrate :fresh -- seed. With this artisan command or Laravel command, we will migrate our database and we will also seed it. Notice, however, that I'm using migrate:fresh here for migrating the database. This means that all the tables will be deleted from my database. And totally new tables will be created while I migrate. So, for example, a totally new users table will be created. This is very useful to do while you are developing your application locally. But of course, in production, don't use this command, so don't delete all the tables from your database. If you do so, you will lose all the information that was stored in your database. But in the demo project, it's totally fine to do that, so we can just run this command. I will press enter. And now our database has been migrated and seeded automatically, and it just took a couple of seconds for me. Let's go back to phpMyAdmin to confirm that our database has been seeded. I will refresh the page. And now I've selected the Sonic emails database, and you see that now it has all these tables. So we migrated all these tables. Let's click on the users table to confirm that our database has been seeded successfully. And indeed, it has been seeded successfully, so the admin user and the member users have been seeded or added to the users table automatically. Now the demo project has been set up successfully, so we can finally launch it. We have completed all the steps in setting up the demo project. So let's confirm that the project is actually working, so let's launch it. Open your browser and navigate to the following URL. localhost/email-marketing, and then press enter. And indeed, we have successfully set up our demo project. This is our home page or welcome page. In this section of the course, I will provide an overview of the project. At this point, I will not explain the code behind the project, because I want you to understand how the project works. I want you to become familiar with it. Of course, in later sections of the course, we will deep dive into the code behind the whole project. But for now, just lean back in your chair and let me explain what the project is about. If you cannot reach the project, no matter how many times you try to reload, always check that the Apache and the MySQL services are running. Neither of my services is running, however, I have to start both to make sure that my demo application is working as intended. I hope you've noticed that as soon as I started these two services, the page reloaded and now I can reach my demo application. Whenever you want to do some work, make sure that the two services are running in the XAMPP control panel. After you finish your work, of course, feel free to stop these services. However, then the demo application will not be reachable anymore. In our demo project, there are three different types of routes. There are routes that only admins can access. There is one route that only registered users or members can access. And there are some general routes that anyone can access. We'll start with the general routes because they are the most important for the current project. The most important route is actually what we see here, so the welcome page or the home page. We can reach it by the following URL, localhost/email-marketing, and actually we don't need the / in the end, it doesn't matter if we have it or not. We have a header where we have a placeholder for a logo and some buttons on the right side for navigation. The home button takes us to the same page. The newsletter button navigates us to the most important part of the page. This is where we will add users to our email marketing lists. They have to provide a name and a valid email address. They have to accept the privacy policy. And once they click on subscribe, we will add the user to our email marketing list. Let's scroll up now, however. If I click on contact, then the focus goes to the Contact Us part of the page. And we have another button, the sign in button, and of course it will take us to the login page. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's open Visual Studio Code and let's check the web.php file inside the routes folder. This is the file where our routes, or at least most of our routes, are defined. Let's scroll down. The first route that is defined is the welcome route, so of course this is our home page. This route simply returns a view, so a blade file, the welcome.blade.php file. You can select the welcome string and you can simply follow the link to reach the blade file. Now the welcome.blade.php file is open. I will close it, however, and I will press Ctrl-Shift-P. A window appears where we can search for files. I will have to delete this closing angle bracket, but here I can search for files in the project, for example welcome.blade, and you see that the file has been found in the project. So don't forget the keyboard combination Ctrl-Shift-P. This is a very efficient way for searching for files in your project and navigating to them. So I will just navigate to the welcome.blade.php file. Later in the course, we'll talk more about what is happening here in this file, for example, in this JavaScript here. But for now, I just want you to see what is actually behind our pages. I would like you to notice that this blade file, so the welcome.blade.php file, actually extends the public app.blade.php file. Let's follow the link, so let's navigate to it. In this blade file, we have included the header, the footer, and the front-end code for the navigation as well. Let's follow the link for the navigation.blade.php. You see that here in this blade file, we have the home button and the subscribe button or the newsletter button, contact button, and so on and so on. So these buttons that we have checked some minutes ago. Let's actually go back to the web.php file to check our routes. The welcome route or the home page is a get route. But right below you can see that we have a post route. It's also a general route. This will be the subscribe to list route. Because this is a post route, of course, we don't have a front end for it. At this point, I just want to mention that when on the home page somebody wants to subscribe, then in the backend this route is hit. So the subscribe to list route is hit. And actually what you can see is that the subscribe to list method of the subscribe controller will take care of this post request. I will search quickly for the subscribe controller. So Ctrl-Shift-P and then subscribe controller. This is the controller that helps us subscribe users to our marketing email lists. Later we will talk about this in more detail, but I just wanted you to get a general idea of how the application works. Of course, not every subscription is successful. For example, if someone doesn't provide any data, then we don't even start the subscription process. Or if someone doesn't provide an email address, then we don't start the subscription process either. But later we will talk about this in much more detail. Let's go back to the web.php file. You see that we have a route group for the admins. So in this group we have all the routes that are accessible only to admins. And below our route group we have a route group defined for members or registered users. We only have one route for the members, but we will talk about this a bit later. Maybe you've noticed that there are no routes defined for registering and logging in. In the demo application for authentication, we use Laravel Fortify. It is one of our dependencies, and if you want to know more about it, you can navigate to this page and read more about Laravel Fortify. What is important from the perspective of this demo project is that Laravel Fortify provides so-called features. For example, the features for registration or resetting passwords and so on and so on. In our project, there is a Fortify configuration file, so let's go back to Visual Studio Code, press Ctrl-Shift-P and search for Fortify. Inside the config folder, we have a fortify.php file. Let's open it. In this file, we should have a features array as described by the documentation, where you see what Laravel Fortify features are enabled in the demo project. What is important for us is actually only the registration feature. Because we have the registration features enabled, users can register and log in into our application. Let's navigate to the registration form. The route is simply register. Of course, this is just a simple registration form, but from the perspective of the demo project, it is very important that we have this subscribe to newsletter checkbox. In the demo project, we have a backend workflow for adding users to our newsletter while they are registering to our application. We have a few settings for this, and actually it is a big topic, and at this section of the course we are not really getting into the code. So for now, let me just show you the blade file that is behind of this register route, and later we'll talk about the backend of the project. Press Ctrl-Shift-P and search for register. We have a register.blade.php file, which is behind our register route or the registration form. The last route I would like to talk about is the login or sign-in route. The route for it is simply login, but I can also click on here on the login button. And here we add the members or the registered users the opportunity to sign in to the application. For this demo project, it doesn't really matter actually if users register or not, because of course we focus on subscribing users to our email marketing list. And this can be done without registration. However, the project includes a login page that you can freely use in your other projects. There is a login.blade.php file that is behind this login page. Let's press Ctrl+Shift+P to search for it. So login.blade.php, and here it is. So this is the file that is behind the login page. These have been the general or freely accessible routes in our project. Of course, the home page is the most important route for us, but it's important that you get an overview of all the important routes that we have in the application. Let's discuss the member route of our application. So let's basically log in to our application. At the bottom of the web.php file, you see a route group defined, and this is the route group for our members or registered users. We actually only have one route for them, so it is a bit of an overkill to specify a route group for one route, but later you might want to add more routes here. And anyway, it is a good opportunity to talk about how route grouping works in Laravel. For our registered users, we have a simple get route. The URL for it is dashboard. However, when we created the route group, we created this associative array. In this associative array, we have a prefix key and the value is member. This means that any route that we specify here will have the member prefix. So instead of /dashboard, we can reach this route by typing member.dashboard. However, we already have this prefix, this member prefix here, so actually I don't have to type this member dash in front of all the member routes, which is very good. I gave a name to this route, and the name of the route is dashboard. However, in this associative array, we have an as key and a member period value, or more like member dot value. This means that inside our application, when we refer to the dashboard route, we won't refer to this route here, because this route is actually called member.dashboard inside our application. But fortunately, I don't have to type this member dot here because I already provided it as the value to the S key. So I can simply delete this. You might not see the benefit of the prefix and the S keys because we only have one route, but if we scroll up a bit, you see that we have an admin route group with considerably more routes. And here it is actually very helpful that I don't have to type admin.dashboard, admin.settings, and so on, because we have an S key here with the value admin dot. But we will discuss the admin routes later, so let's scroll down. We have a middleware key, and we provided the auth middleware here, which means that only authenticated or logged in users can reach this route. Because we are using Laravel Fortify, it's enough to provide the auth value here, so Fortify will make sure that the auth middleware will run on this request, so only logged in members can reach this route. Let's actually try to reach this route without being logged in. So the route is member/dashboard. Laravel automatically redirected us to the login page. Because this request failed at the auth middleware, we couldn't reach the route. We can go to the home page and try the same. So if I try to reach member.dashboard without being logged in, I will be directed to the login page. However, if the user provides the correct login details, then the index method of the member controller will take care of the rest. Let's search for this file. And let's open it. Apart from defining a meta title for the page, the index method simply returns the dashboard.blade.php file inside the member folder. So let's follow the link. So this is the front end basically that we will see if we log into the application. Let's try it now. I will go to the login page. The email address should be member@member.com, and the password will be 12341234, and then we can sign into the application. You see that indeed we have been navigated to the member/dashboard page, and we see the same message here as we see in the dashboard.blade.php file. One last thing I want to mention is that we have this member controller here, which is defined in the app HTTP controller's member namespace. If we go back to the web.php file, you see that we have defined a namespace for this route group, and this is the member namespace. So when I specify the class or controller that should take care of the request, the namespace is already implied because of this line of code. So instead of member controller, it is enough that I typed the member controller here. Based on the namespace here, Laravel figures out that the member controller in the member namespace must be used for this route. The last thing I want to mention is, of course, we can log out of the application. Once a member logs in, then we will have this logout button. So if we click on it, then we are logged out and we see the home page again. Let's talk about the admin routes. If we check the web.php file in Visual Studio Code, we see that we have a route group for the admin routes. When we seeded our database, we seeded 2 users. Let's check the users table seeder.php file. I'll press Ctrl+Shift+P and search for users table seeder. It's here. The first user that we seeded is admin@admin.com, and the role ID of the user is 1. This means that the user is an admin user. The second user that we seeded is a member user, member@member.com, and the role ID of the user is 2. We also have a roles table seeder.php file, based on which we see that we have an admin role and we have a member role. If we check phpMyAdmin, we see that we have a roles table, and ID1 belongs to the admin user, ID2 belongs to the member user. Only an admin can reach the admin routes, of course. If we check our admin routes, we see that in the route group we defined 2 middlewares. Auth is the middleware that checks if the user is logged in. If the user is logged in, another middleware comes, the admin middleware. Let's search for admin middleware.php. This middleware basically checks if the user is authenticated and if the authenticated user has a role ID of 1. If so, then the user will reach the admin routes. If not, however, then the user is redirected to the member dashboard. There are quite a few admin routes. For now, however, we will only talk about the dashboard route, the admin.dashboard route. Don't forget that on our route group, we defined an ASCII with the value of admin dot, which means that the actual name of this route is not dashboard but admin.dashboard. And because we also defined the prefix as admin, the way to reach the admin dashboard is by the route /admin. But I don't have to write admin here because we have already a prefix defined. Before showing you the admin dashboard, I just want to say that of course we'll discuss all the other routes as well in the course, but we will do that later. Let's log in as an admin, so let's check the admin dashboard. Don't forget that in the users table seeder, you can always check the password that we defined for the user. The password of the admin user is 12341234, which is good for a demo project, but of course this should never be used in production. This password is actually hashed by the bcrypt function. That's why in our actual database on phpMyAdmin, we see the hashed values and not the actual passwords. Let's now navigate to the login page and log in as an admin, admin@admin.com, and the password is 12341234. Let's sign in. So this is the admin dashboard. As you can see, the URL is localhost/emailmarketing/admin. The admin dashboard doesn't really have a functionality. There is just some useful information about what you can do in the settings menu. I'll give you a quick overview of the other options in the admin area, but first let's go back to the web.php file and check the controller and its method that takes care of this request. We have a dashboard controller in the admin namespace. You see that in the route group we defined the namespace as admin, And this dashboard controller in the admin namespace should have an index method. Now let's search for the dashboard controller class. It will be the second one. And indeed, it does have an index method that returns the index.blade.php file from the admin folder. This is the front end for our admin dashboard. This blade file actually extends the admin app.blade.php file, which includes the header, the sidebar, and the footer. Now that we know what files our front end is made of, let's check the other menu options in the admin area. We have a settings menu. In the settings, we can select the email marketing provider that we want to use. These are the providers that we can use. These providers have been seeded into our database. We have an Add Users to List option that is checkbox by default. This means that we automatically add the user to our mailing list if the user registers and checks the subscribe to newsletter checkbox here. We have some other options as well actually, the automatic and the no options. But we will talk about these options a bit later. The last setting we have is about automatically checking the subscribe checkbox on registration. It is a yes or no or Boolean option, which is only important if here we select the checkbox. Currently, the subscribe checkbox is not selected automatically when someone hits the registration page. But if I change the setting to yes here and save the settings, then first of all I get this success message that the setting has been changed successfully. And second of all, of course, if I refresh this page, now the subscribe checkbox is checked automatically. I can still uncheck it, but automatically when I refresh the page, it is checked by default. Later we will check the code for this, so we will talk about it in more detail. But for now, let's finish the overview of the admin area. We have a blacklist menu where we can add some prohibited email domains or prohibited email addresses. If an email address is prohibited, it means that that email address is not able to subscribe to our newsletter. For example, by default, test@test.com and test@test.com are not able to subscribe to any of our newsletters. We can also specify prohibited email domains. @tests.com is defined by default, which means that no email address from the domain @tests.com can subscribe to any of our newsletters. We'll talk about how this all works on the backend. The last menu we have is the email providers menu, and it's actually a drop-down. Here we can change the settings for the 5 marketing providers that are integrated into the demo project. We have the Sandy settings here, the Mailchimp settings, ConvertKit, SendInBlue, and the GetResponse settings. In this section of the course, we are going to look at how Mailchimp is integrated into our demo project. This is a very important section because we'll talk about the backend of the demo application a lot. For example, how to provide the necessary data for the Mailchimp integration, how to put emails on a blacklist, and how users get subscribed onto our email marketing list. We'll also talk about the code with which we can subscribe users automatically on the mailing list during registration. Let's log in as an admin first, and let's see what information we have to provide for the Mailchimp integration. I will click on Sign In. I will provide the email address admin@admin.com, and the password is 12341234. First, we have to make sure that Mailchimp is the selected service provider in the settings menu. Mailchimp is selected by default, which means that whenever a user subscribes to our marketing list, the demo app will try to subscribe the user on our Mailchimp list. The Add Users to List option and the automatically checked subscribe checkbox on registration options are not important for now. However, we'll talk about them in more detail later. Later, we will also talk about the code that is behind the settings menu. But now, let's check the email provider menu. From the drop-down, let's select Mailchimp. Here we see the data that the Mailchimp integration requires in the demo application. We need a Mailchimp API key, a Mailchimp list ID, and a server prefix. We seeded the placeholder strings for these options, but of course these are all useless. The integration does not work with placeholders. Later in the course, we'll check the code that makes it possible to update these values, but now we'll check how we can get these 3 pieces of data for our Mailchimp integration. We are going to create a Mailchimp audience. An audience in Mailchimp is basically a mailing list. Navigate to Mailchimp.com. If you don't have an account, you have to register first. It's totally free to register and get started with Mailchimp. I do have an account, so I'll go ahead and log in. This is my Mailchimp dashboard. We can create an audience here. But what is an audience exactly? Let's navigate to mailchimp.com/help/create-audience. A critical first step to getting started with Mailchimp is setting up your audience. Whether you're starting from scratch or bringing existing contacts into Mailchimp, your audience is where you'll store and manage all your contact data. In short, we need an audience to store all the users' email addresses who subscribe through the demo application. With a free account, we can create only one audience, but it's perfect for testing our integration. If I scroll down, you see that this web page explains how you can create an audience. Feel free to use this page as a reference, but now I'll simply go to my dashboard and explain the steps for creating an audience there. We need to come to this audience section here. Simply click on the audience dashboard option, and because I don't have any audiences, I can just simply click on the create audience button here. Notice the URL here, it ends with new list. So basically an audience is just a fancy name for a mailing list. We of course have to provide some data for this audience. I will call it my demo audience. I will provide my email address as the default from email address. And the default from name will be only Mark. You might have to provide some contact information for the audience. My contact information is already here, so I don't have to do anything. I do believe, however, that we have to provide a reminder, because if I try to save this, it won't work. And indeed, I have to enter a value or some text here. I will keep it simple, so I will just type you subscribed through the demo application. And now I will try to save this. Our audience has been successfully created. Currently, our audience has 0 contacts, but this will not stay like this for long. Let's see where to find our Mailchimp API key. Navigate to mailchimp.com/help/about-api-keys. First, let's check what an API is. API stands for Application Programming Interface. It can be helpful to think of the API as a way for different apps to talk to one another. For many users, the main interaction with the API will be through API keys, which allow other apps to access your account without you giving out your password. Simply put, Mailchimp has an API or Application Programming Interface that makes it possible for our demo application to communicate with Mailchimp. In order to successfully communicate or interact with Mailchimp, we of course have to generate or find our API key. I will scroll down a bit, and here is a link. Click this link to navigate to the API keys section of your Mailchimp account. I will click on the link. This is the section of the dashboard where we can find our API key. I will show you an alternative way to reaching this part of the dashboard. You can click on your icon here, then click on Account and Billing, click on Extras and API Keys, and we will get to the same section of the dashboard as before. In your API Key section, you can either create a new API key or use an API key you already have. I'll use the one that I already have. Make sure that the status of your API key is active. You can disable your API key by clicking on this button. If you think your API key has been compromised, disable it immediately and create a new one. However, in that case, you have to make sure you update your API key in your application that communicates with Mailchimp. If you disable an API key, it can no longer be used successfully with an integration. I will copy my API key and I will go back to the demo application and simply paste it here and save the settings. Let's see where to find our Mailchimp list ID, which is actually, of course, the audience ID. Let's go back to the Mailchimp dashboard. In the audience menu, click on the All Contacts submenu, click on Settings, and click on Audience Name and Defaults. On the right side, you see your audience ID. some plugins and integrations may request your audience ID. Typically, this is what they want. Let's simply copy this audience ID, paste it here for the Mailchimp list ID, and save our settings. Notice that once the settings have been successfully updated, we get this success message here. A bit later we will talk about how this works on the backend, so how we get the success message. But for now it's enough to know that when we save the settings, then we should see this success message to know that the settings have been successfully updated. We see that for now we have 0 contacts in our audience. By providing the audience ID to the demo application, we make sure that when a user successfully subscribes to our mailing list, then this user will be added to this specific audience, so the My Demo audience in my case. The last piece of data we need for our integration is the Mailchimp server prefix. Let's navigate to mailchimp.com/developer/marketing/guides/quick-start. This page is part of the documentation provided by Mailchimp for developers. This is not the last time we check the developer documentation, but for now what we need is the server prefix. Press Ctrl F and search for server prefix. We found it in the Make Your First API call section. To find the value for the server parameter used in Mailchimp.setConfig, log into your Mailchimp account and look at the URL in your browser. You'll see something like https://us19.admin.mailchimp.com. The US19 part is the server prefix. Note that your specific value may be different. We don't have to deal with this Mailchimp.setConfig thing. What is important for us is that now we know how to find our server prefix. Let's go back to the Mailchimp dashboard and simply let's take a look at the URL. My URL starts with US10, so my server prefix is US10. By the way, there is a good chance that your API key will also end with your server prefix, but I don't know this for sure. I will simply copy this part of the URL and paste it to the Mailchimp server prefix input box and save my settings. With these 3 pieces of data, we will be able to subscribe the users to our Mailchimp audience. Before we start talking about how to subscribe users, let's check how the backend for updating the Mailchimp settings works. Based on the URLs, we see that we must have an admin/providers/Mailchimp route defined in our web.php file. Let's confirm this, so let's go to Visual Studio Code and open the file. Don't forget that you can search for files in Visual Studio Code with the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-P or simply Ctrl-P. In the admin route group, we can indeed find this route. It is providers/Mailchimp, however, don't forget that we have specified the admin prefix here. So for the admin route group, the admin prefix is specified, which means that the admin/part is implied for all the routes in this route group. So this route is of course actually admin/providers/Mailchimp. This is a get route, and the Mailchimp method of the Mailchimp controller.php file takes care of the request. Now let's find this Mailchimp controller file. I will press Ctrl-P and search for it. And here it is. Now here is the Mailchimp method. Of course it is actually a function, but usually we call the controller functions methods, and actually in PHP we usually call every function of a class a method. This controller returns the mailchimp.blade.php file or view, but it also saves the Mailchimp configs from the database to a config variable and passes this variable to our view. Let's navigate to PHP MyAdmin and find the Mailchimp configs table. This table contains only one record or row. Here we saved the necessary data to successfully communicate with the Mailchimp API. The API key, the list or audience ID, and the server prefix. Let's check our view, so let's check the mailchimp.blade.php file. If I scroll through the file, maybe the first thing that you notice is that we don't see the texts or the strings in the file that we see on the front end. For example, we don't see the text paste your Mailchimp API key here anywhere in the view. Instead of the text, what we see in this file is, for example, these double curly brackets, then dash dash admin.mc API key info, and then again closing double curly brackets. We don't hard code the front-end strings. Instead, we use files where we store the strings. For example, every text you see in the admin area of the demo application is in the admin.php file. I press Ctrl P and search for admin.php. I found it. In this file, we should find the MC API key, and it's here. Yes, it's here. But actually, I think I wanted to find the MC API key info, but this is here as well. Now, the value associated with this key is what we see on the front end. Paste your Mailchimp API key here, and so on and so on. So the front end strings are in this file. This file basically contains a big associative array. We retrieve the values or the strings based on keys. For example, as we have seen, the key is MC API key info, and the value is what we see on the front end. We do this for two reasons. Firstly, if we wanted to make the demo application multilingual, we could do that easily this way. The demo app is currently only in English. However, using the language files in the resources lang folder, we could easily make the application multilingual. Secondly, the blade file is cleaner this way. Instead of typing long strings here, we simply echo out the relevant strings or values. If you're not familiar with the double curly bracket syntax, it is a directive that the blade file translates as PHP echo. The dash dash, so the double dash here, is for telling blade that we want to use a language file here. We specify that we want to get the value associated with the MC API key info key from the admin.php file. When we updated the data for the Mailchimp integration in the demo app, for example the API key, we saw a success message. Let's recheck this. I will update the server prefix, and then I will click on Save Settings, and indeed we see this success message. Let's go back to the blade file or the view. In the view, we see an if blade directive, so basically an if statement here. If a session variable named success message was set, we show the user this success message. If, however, updating the settings was not successful, we will see a failure message, because then we should have a failure message variable set in the session, and the if statement below will be evaluated to true. Let's see an example for this. I will update the server prefix, but this time I will delete everything, so it will be an empty string. I click on Save Settings, and now we see the failure message. We also see that the failure was associated with the server prefix. It is a required field, so it cannot be an empty string. You might have already noticed that in our blade file, we use the old method. For example, here for the list ID field. The old method is important when we fail to update the data successfully. Let's go back to the front end. For the list ID, I will provide 1, 2, 3, 4, but still I will not provide anything for the server prefix. I will try to save the settings. Although we were not able to update the settings because still I didn't provide a server prefix, if I want to try again updating, I don't have to type 1, 2, 3, 4 again, because thanks to the old method, the previous values were preserved. I will, however, make a last update. Of course, I will provide the correct server prefix now, and I will also provide my audience ID. So now I will save the settings. It should be a success, and it is. And now I have the correct data, so my integration should work. When we save the Mailchimp settings here, of course, we are submitting a form. Let's scroll up a bit so we can see the beginning of the form, and here it is. We specify the method to be a post method, and with the route helper here, we specify the route to which we will post the data. The route helper takes the name of the route, so we should have a route in the web.php file with the name admin.mailchimp.update. Let's confirm that we have this route. So I search for the web.php file, and indeed we have a route like this. So the name of this route is Mailchimp.update, but don't forget that for the admin route group, we have an S key and we specified it to be admin dot, which means that when we name a route, then the admin dot part at the beginning is implied. So for this route, the name is actually admin.mailchimp.update, the same as we can see it in the blade file. Notice that there are two additional blade directives associated with this form. The @csrf directive, which protects us from cross-site request forgery, and the @method directive, where we specify that Laravel should actually handle this request as a put request because we want to update an already existing resource. If we go back to the web.php file, you see that this route, so this route that takes care of updating the settings, is indeed defined as a put route and not a post route. When we submit this form here, then the update Mailchimp method of the Mailchimp controller takes care of it. Let's find the Mailchimp controller and let's check the update Mailchimp method. So I will press Ctrl P, I will type Mailchimp controller, here it is, and we should have the update Mailchimp method, and it is here. When we try to update the Mailchimp settings here, then this is the method that takes care of the update request. The method receives the request object, so basically all the data that we posted. First we try to get the Mailchimp configs, so basically we check if there is a Mailchimp configs table in the database. If we don't find the Mailchimp configs, of course, we will return with a failure message, because of course then we cannot save our posted data into our database. Then we specify our validation rules, so we create a validator object. For all three fields, the validation rules are the same. They are all required, they all have to be strings, and they cannot be longer than 1000 characters. When I tried to update the server prefix with an empty string earlier, the required rule failed, hence the validation failed. If the fails method of our validator object returns true, it means that at least one validation rule failed. In this case, we retrieve the errors, the validation errors from our validation object, and this should be in JSON format. We beautify it a bit using the beautify.json method of our global helper. This basically means that we make the errors more readable or user-friendly by removing unnecessary characters, for example, unnecessary brackets. Let's search for the global helper file, so press Ctrl P and type global helper, it's here. And here is the beautify.json method. As I've said, basically it just removes some unnecessary characters, so the error JSON or the error message will be much more readable and user-friendly. This global helper class is actually not part of Laravel, this is something that I implemented myself. But of course feel free to use this file in any of your future projects. But now let's go back to the Mailchimp controller. Of course, if the validation fails and we get our beautify.json, we redirect back with a failure message, and this contains our beautified.json, so the beautified errors. So the beautified validation error messages will be shown on our frontend. For this, we saw examples earlier. When I tried to update the server prefix with an empty string, then the required rule failed, and then in the end we redirected back with the validation errors. If, however, the validation passes, then we of course save the new values into our database, and then we redirect with a success message. This way we will see the success message at the top of the page after we updated the values successfully. Luckily, we have already seen many instances of this. Let's talk about the most important part of the demo application, subscribing users to our mailing list. This is the point where we check the code behind our welcome page. Let's open the welcome.blade.php file. Notice that we don't have a form on this page. However, we do have a submit button. This submit button is of course the subscribe button on the front end. When the user clicks this button, the subscribe manager JavaScript function is called. This is the starting point for validating the provided name and email address and subscribing the user to our mailing list. If we scroll down a bit, you'll notice that we have JavaScript code in this view. First, we declare some variables. These variables refer to the submit or subscribe button and the HTML divs and spans that we use to give feedback to the user because the user either successfully subscribed to our mailing list or not. In the Subscribe Manager, we disable the Submit button and delete and hide all previous success or failure messages. Then we extract the provided name and the provided email address. These variables then are passed to the validateFront function. This is the function that takes care of the front-end validations. If they are successful, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. If the validations fail, we simply return from the Subscribe Manager. But if the front-end validations succeed, then we call the subscribe email function with the provided name and email address. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and let's first check what front-end validations we have. The front-end validation is done by the validateFront JavaScript function. The function receives the provided name and the provided email address as parameters. If the name is an empty string, then the front-end validation fails and it returns false, but before returning, it calls the showError function. An error message string gets passed to the showError function as well. We saw earlier that we have an admin.php file where we store strings in an associative array. We also have a email-marketing.php file where we store key value pairs that are outside the admin area. Let's search for this file and let's search for the provide name key inside that file. So the file is email-marketing.php, this is the one. And the provide name key is the first one actually in the file, so the string associated with it is please provide a name. So the showError function gets this string, this please provide a name string, passed as a parameter. Let's check the showError function. In the showError function, we make sure that any previous success messages are deleted and hidden. Then we show the error message that was passed as a parameter to the function. And of course, we enable the submit button again, so the user can try again subscribing with different details. Let's go back to the validateFront function. If the user provided a name, then we do a simply regular expression check on the front end. The regex rule here makes sure that the user provided at least one upper or lowercase letter in the name. For example, if I provide a curly bracket as a name, it fails the validation. However, if I provide a curly bracket and an A, so the character A, it passes the validation. Let's actually check this on the front end. So I will just type a curly bracket here and try to subscribe. And we see that the front end validation failed and we received the following error message, please provide a valid name. However, if I provide a curly bracket and an A and I try to subscribe, then I receive a different front-end validation message or error message. This time the problem is that I didn't provide an email address. However, we now see that the name validation has been passed. Of course, this validation rule is very simple, so the provided name and email are also validated on the backend. The best course of action is to have both front-end and backend validation in your application. In this case, the front-end validation for the name is very simple, but will also validate the provided name on the backend. However, the provided data can only hit the backend once the front-end validation passes, which is a more user-friendly approach, and the performance is also better, because we don't use the backend unnecessarily. For example, when a user forgets to provide a name or makes a typo in the email address, we will not hit the backend at all because the front-end validation will pick these up. If the provided name has been successfully validated, then we turn our attention to the provided email. Just like in the case of the provided name, first we have to check if an email has been provided at all. If no email has been provided, then of course the front-end validation fails, we show the error and return false. Let's check this. So now I will provide a name, Mark, but I will not provide an email. If I try to subscribe, I will receive this error message, please provide an email. However, if an email has been provided, then we check if it's in a valid format. With this regular expression rule, we basically make sure that the provided email has an @ symbol in it. And we also make sure that it contains a domain, for example, .gmail.com. This is a more thorough validation than the name validation, but of course the provided email address will also be validated on the backend. If the email is also valid, we check if the user has accepted the privacy policy. In other words, if this checkbox here on the front end is checked. In the demo application, we actually don't have a privacy policy. However, usually local and international laws require the user to accept the privacy policy before subscribing to a mailing list. If all the front-end validations succeed, the validate front function returns true. So we go back to the subscribe manager. In case the validate front function returns true, then we don't return from the subscribe manager, but we call the subscribe email function with the provided name and the email address. Before, however, checking the subscribe email function, let's go back to the front end and let's make sure that the front end validations for the email address and the privacy policy are working as expected. I will refresh the page. I will provide my name here, and if I don't provide an email address, then we receive this message, please provide an email, so this seems to be working. Now I will provide an email address without an @ symbol, let's say. Now I will try to subscribe. And now we got a different error message, please provide a valid email, which is fine. And now I will add an add sign to the email. And now I will try to subscribe. The error message now is again different. Please accept the privacy policy. However, the front-end validations for the email were passed. So if I actually check the checkbox and try to subscribe, everything should work well. So I should be able to subscribe to the mailing list. But I don't want to do it just yet. So a bit later, we will come back to the form and we will subscribe, and we will see that the front-end validation for the privacy checkbox will also pass as expected. After the front-end validations pass, the subscribe email JavaScript function is called with the provided email and the provided email address. We are using the fetch API in this function. Let's navigate to the following website to get some more information about the fetch API. The fetch API provides a JavaScript interface for accessing and manipulating parts of the protocol, such as requests and responses. It also provides a global fetch method that provides an easy, logical way to fetch resources asynchronously across the network. Basically, by using the fetch API, we can send asynchronous requests using JavaScript. In the fetch function, we provide the URL where we want to send our request. We see that we should have a subscribe to list route defined in the web.php file. Let's check it. I will scroll up, and indeed we have a route that ends with subscribe to list. This is a post route. The requests that we send here will be picked up by the subscribe to list method of the subscribe controller. Let's search for the subscribe controller with Ctrl P. Here is the file, and we see that the only method that this file contains or this class contains is the subscribe to list method. We'll get back to the subscribe to list method a bit later, but now we'll continue checking the JavaScript code in the welcome.blade.php file. Now we know that the subscribe controller will take care of the request that we send here. We are sending a post request with the fetch method, and we also specify two headers for the request. We specify that we are going to send JSON, and we also specify an XCSRF token header. We are using Laravel's CSRF token helper method to get the CSRF token so that we can send it with the request. Notice that in the JavaScript code we also use the double curly bracket syntax. Don't forget that we are in a Blade file, so the double curly brackets will echo out or print out the CSRF token. This is why it's working inside the JavaScript code as well. Of course, we are sending a request body, and this body is in JSON format. We send the provided name and the email with the request. Of course, the provided name is associated with the name key, and the provided email will be associated with the email key in our JSON. Don't forget that we are sending an asynchronous request here, so we don't actually know when the response will arrive. We are chaining then handlers after our fetch call. When the response is ready, the first then handler will run. In the then handler, we have a function that receives a parameter called res. This res parameter is actually the response object. Here, the only thing we check if the OK property of the response object is true or not. If the OK property of the response object is false, it means that something went wrong with the request. So in this case, for sure, the user could not subscribe to our mailing list. If the response is not OK, then we return some JSON with an error property. We can quickly check the value in the email marketing file, so we will send the string associated with this key, unexpected error request. I will search for it in the file. So this is the value that we associate with the error property in our JSON. An unexpected error occurred while sending the request. So if the OK property of the response object is not true, then we return this JSON here. So the error property and the string. However, if the OK property of the response object is not false or it's true, then we simply return the response object in a JSON format. It's very important to understand that when we return from the first then handler, so from this then handler, it doesn't mean that we return from the subscribe email function. It means that we return, or more like pass some data to the second then handler. So the then handler that is chained after this first then handler. We've already discussed that we have two then handlers chained after our fetch call. Once the first then handler returns, either here or here, the second then handler starts to execute. The second then handler receives a parameter called data. This data parameter is actually what is returned from the first then handler. So it's either this JSON with an error property, or the response object is returned as JSON. If the data parameter has a success property, it means that the user has been successfully subscribed to our mailing list, so we will show a success message. If, however, there is no success property, but there is an error property, then we show an error to the user. It should not happen, but if there is neither a success nor an error property in the data parameter, we consider that simply an error and show an error message. I'll change the code so that the OK property of the response object will be false, and we'll see what happens if there was a problem with the request. I will add 1, 2, 3 to a route here. Of course, we don't have a route like this. So the OK property of the response object will not be true, it will be false. Let's go to the front end. I'll provide my name and a valid email address. I will accept the privacy checkbox, and now I will try to subscribe. We received the following error message. An unexpected error occurred while sending the request. What happened is that when the response object arrived, or when the response arrived, the then handler, the first then handler, picked it up, but the OK property of the response object was false. So we returned a JSON with an error key or error property to the second then handler. And because of the error property, so because the data parameter had an error property, we showed the error message to the user. And this is where the process ended. By the way, this little test showed us that indeed the front-end validation for the privacy checkbox works as expected. Because this checkbox was checked, all the front-end validations passed, and we received an error message that came from the subscribe email function and not from the front-end validation. I will actually correct this URL, I don't want to forget about it, so this should be the correct one. The time has come to check what happens in the subscribe controller when we want to subscribe a user to our mailing list. In the subscribe controller, we have some private string variables. These are just the names of the currently available email service provider integrations. We have a Mailchimp variable that will be important for us a bit later. The subscribe to list method receives a request object. The request object contains the provided name and the email. We validate both the name and the email. So this is the backend validation of the provided data. Earlier we did the front-end validation, but it is very important that we do a backend validation as well. The name is a required field, it must be a string, and it cannot be longer than 100 characters. Actually, the validation rules for the name could be stricter. If we look at the available validation rules in Laravel, so if we navigate to this website, we see that we could make sure that only alphabetic characters could be provided, or only alphanumeric characters, or alphanumeric characters with dashes and underscores. It's up to you if you want to use these rules. In the demo application, we keep things simple. This means that we might receive some nonsensical name like curly brace A, and it still passes the validation. However, we are not that interested in the provided name. The provided email is much more important for us, so we are fine in the demo application if a user wants to provide some nonsense as a name. The email validation rules are stricter. The email is required, has to be a string, has to be in the correct format, and cannot be longer than 100 characters. Additionally, it also has to pass these two custom validation rules that I implemented: the blacklisted domain rule and the blacklisted email rule. Let's stop here for a minute and let's talk about these two custom validation rules. I am in the admin area of the demo application and I have selected the blacklist menu. Earlier we saw that in this admin area we can put emails or whole domains on our blacklist. With the two custom rules here, we check if the provided email address is blacklisted or not. Very soon we'll talk about these validation rules in more detail, but let's just quickly check what happens if the validation fails. We save the validation errors into the error.json variable. Then we beautify it a bit, meaning that we get rid of the unnecessary characters like brackets that make it harder for the user to read the error message. We talked about this beautify.json method a bit earlier, but let's find it again. In the global helper class, we have this method which will get rid of some unnecessary characters and returns a beautified string. After this beautified string is returned, we create an associative array with an error key. The key will hold or will be associated with our beautified error message. We will then convert this associative array into JSON, and we will return it. If we check the admin area, we see that the @tests.com domain is a prohibited or blacklisted domain. I will try to subscribe with a blacklisted domain. So I will go back to the welcome page. I will provide the name here, Joe, and then an email address with a blacklisted domain, so @tests.com. I will accept the privacy checkbox, and if I try to subscribe, we should fail the backend validation. Indeed, we got the following error message: the email domain is not allowed @tests.com. When I try to subscribe here, I successfully sent the request from the fetch API or from the fetch function. It was successfully picked up by the subscribe controller. However, our blacklisted domain rule came into play and it failed the validation. So a JSON with an error property was returned. And don't forget that we sent the request using the fetch API. And when the response arrived, so when this JSON arrived with the error property, then the response was actually OK. So the OK property of the response was true. The OK property is false only if there is a problem with the request itself. But in this case, the request was totally fine. It was picked up by the subscribe controller and we received a response with an error property. But in the first then handler, we don't care about the error property. We just want to know that the request was performed successfully, and it was actually performed successfully. However, the validation still failed. But in the second then handler, we check if there is an error property. And in this case it does. So in the subscribe controller, the subscribe to list method returned JSON with an error property which was picked up by the second then handler here. So we showed an error to the user. We showed the following error message: the email domain is not allowed. But where does this error message come from? We know that we failed a custom validation rule, so it must come from there. So it's really time to talk about the custom validation rules that we have here. You can read about custom validation rules in the Laravel documentation on this URL. You can simply use this artisan command to create a custom rule in your Laravel application. I have of course already created the custom rules, so let's search for them. Our custom validation rules are in the app rules directory. I will search for the blacklisted domain rule file. You see that it is indeed in the rules directory, and this rules directory is of course in the app directory. We have a private email domain variable and 3 methods. The first method is called construct, so of course it is a constructor, but we don't need to put any code here. The second method called passes, and the third method is called message. The passes method returns true if the validation was successful, but returns false if the validation failed. So if our custom validation rule fails here, then we return false from the passes method. If the custom validation fails, the message method is called and our customized message is returned. Notice that actually this is the message that we showed on the front end earlier. The email domain is not allowed. Let's check the passes method in more detail now. We want to get a domain from the email address, so we check if there is an @ symbol in the provided email address. If not, then return false. We have an index of @sign variable, and of course if the provided email has an @sign, then the index of it is saved into the variable. The passes method receives 2 parameters, and the value parameter will be what we validate against, so in this case it will be the provided email. On this line of code, we save the email domain from the provided email address into the email domain variable. Don't forget that we have this private email domain variable in the class here. Basically, we extract everything from the provided email address from the @ symbol. Then we check if the domain, the extracted domain, exists in our blacklisted domains table in the database. If it exists, so if it is not null, it means that the domain exists in the database, so it is a blacklisted domain, and we return false. Otherwise, of course, we return true, so if the email domain does not exist in the blacklisted domains table, then it means that it is not blacklisted, so the domain is not blacklisted. We can return true, which means that the validation passed. Let's check the other custom validation rule, the blacklisted email rule. If we go to the admin area, to the blacklist menu, we see that there are currently 2 email addresses on our blacklist, so 2 email addresses are blacklisted. One of them is also on the domain blacklist, so the @tests.com domain is blacklisted, and this second blacklisted email address has this exact domain. So let me try to subscribe with this email address, so with the @test.com email address. So the domain is not blacklisted here, but the email itself is blacklisted. Let's see what happens if I try to subscribe with the blacklisted email. We failed the validation, the custom validation, and we received the following error message: this email address is not allowed. This message, of course, comes from the message method of the blacklisted email rule class. As a comment here, I put what the actual message will be. In this class, we also have a passes method and a construct method, but it is empty, so the passes method is more important for us. This passes method is somewhat simpler than the previous passes method that we checked. We simply check if the provided email address is available in our blacklisted emails table in the database. If it is available, so if the blacklisted email variable is not null, it means that a blacklisted email was provided and we return false. So we fail the validation. Don't forget that the value variable here, so the value parameter, actually contains the provided email address, so the provided value against which we validate. So the logic here is very simple. If the email exists in the blacklisted emails table, then we fail the validation because it's blacklisted, otherwise we return true and the validation rule is passed. It's time that we check the backend that makes it possible that we can add or delete blacklisted emails and blacklisted email domains. We see that we are on the admin/blacklist route here. Let's check the web.php file. Indeed, we have a route that ends with blacklist, but don't forget that we are in the admin route group, so we have an admin prefix here, which means that the admin/ is implied here. So this route is actually admin/blacklist, the same as we can see here on the front end. So this is the route that will actually return our blacklisted emails and domains. So this is the route associated with this front-end admin area. And actually when we try to update our blacklist, so when we click on Save Settings, then the request will be picked up by the route below, by this blacklist/update route. We see that both routes are picked up by the settings controller. In the settings controller, we should have a blacklist and an update blacklist method. Let's search for the file. It is here. Let's search for the blacklist method. It is here. In the blacklist method, we pluck or retrieve the values of the domain column from the blacklisted domains table. We do have a blacklisted domain model, and we can actually search for this model. This model is of course associated with the blacklisted domains table in our database. If we want to see the structure of the table itself, we can of course check the relevant migration file and the database itself. I will search for the migration file. This will be the create blacklisted domains table. So this table has an ID column, then a domain column and timestamps. We can confirm this in phpMyAdmin, so I have to search for the blacklisted domains table, and indeed it has an ID column, a domain column, and the timestamp columns, the created at and the updated at columns. But let's get back to the settings controller and the blacklist method. So we retrieve all the blacklisted domains from the table. If there is at least one blacklisted domain, so this array is not empty, then we call the getSeparatedStringFromArray method of the global helper. This method creates a string from the array and separates each array element with a separator that we specify. When we call this method here, then we pass the pipe character as the second argument. So it will basically create this string that you see in the front end, so a string separated by pipe characters. A bit later you will see that if we want to add a blacklisted domain or a blacklisted email, we have to separate the string with pipe characters on the admin area. Now let's actually search for the global helper and search for this getSeparatedStringFromArray method. I should have the global helper open somewhere. Yes, it's here. The getSeparatedStringFromArray method is here at the bottom. It receives an array and a separator. This is the pipe character in our case, and then it basically creates a string from the array that we passed, and it separates each array element with the separator that was passed to the method. And then of course this string separated by the pipe characters in our case is returned. Let's get back to the blacklist method of the settings controller. Basically, we do the same to the blacklisted emails as we did to the blacklisted domains. We try to retrieve all the blacklisted email addresses from the blacklisted emails table in our database. And if there is at least one blacklisted email, then we create this separated string, this string that is separated by pipe characters. You can see that we use the same method for the domains and for the emails as well. Let's go to the front end Notice that if we only have one blacklisted email domain, for example, then we don't have a pipe character on the front end. However, if we have at least two blacklisted elements, let's say, then they are separated by a pipe character. After we retrieve the blacklisted emails and domains, we return the blacklist.blade.php file or view. Notice that the blacklisted domains and emails are passed onto the view. Let's now check the view or the code behind the view. Let's follow the link so we can check the blacklist.blade.php file. This is actually a very simple Blade template. We show the blacklisted domains and the blacklisted emails inside a form. If we make any changes to our blacklist, we can of course submit our form to the admin.blacklist.update route. Don't forget that we are using the route helper here, so basically this is the name of the route. If we successfully update the blacklist, then a success message is shown. We already know that the update blacklist method of the settings controller picks up the request, so picks up the submitted form, so to say. So it's time to take a look at the update blacklist method. The update blacklist method receives a request object. We receive here in this request object everything that was posted from the blacklist site of the admin area. If we didn't receive any blacklisted domains, which means that if we received an empty string as a blacklisted domain, then we simply truncate our blacklisted domains table in the database. In other words, we delete everything from the blacklisted domains table. Because of course, if an empty string is received, then it means that there are no blacklisted domains. If, however, there is at least one blacklisted domain, then we will save it or save the blacklisted domains into the blacklisted domain string variable. Then we will create an array from this variable. So we create an array from the blacklisted domain string variable, and we will save this array to the blacklisted domain array variable. We use the getArrayFromSeparatedString method of the global helper to create an array from the provided string. Let's check this. So let's go to the global helper, and this is the getArrayFromSeparatedString method. We receive a string, and this string should be separated by a character. In the demo application, this separator should be the pipe character. And the getArrayFromSeparatedString method should also receive the pipe character as the second parameter, as the separator parameter. Then basically we return an array based on the string, and of course each array element will be the separated string. In other words, if we go to the front end, for example, we have a string that is separated by a pipe character, so we will have two array elements. This will be the first array element, and then this one will be the second array element. So it's very important, and then when we later will add more prohibited email domains and email addresses, then we will have to separate each domain and email address by a pipe character. Otherwise, they will not be saved correctly into our database. Now let's get back to the code, to the updated blacklist method of the settings controller. Once we receive our array of blacklisted domains, we still truncate the blacklisted domains table, so we delete everything from it. Then we loop over each array element, so each blacklisted domain in the blacklisted domain array, and we save it to the database, so we add it to the blacklisted domains table. We do exactly the same with the blacklisted emails. If there are no blacklisted emails coming with a request, then we simply delete everything from the blacklisted emails table, because there should be no blacklisted emails at all. Otherwise, we create an array from the blacklisted emails that we received. Then we delete everything from the blacklisted emails table, and then we add each array element, so each blacklisted email, into the blacklisted emails table. After that, we will be redirected to the admin.blacklist route with a success message. Now let's confirm that this process works as I described it. First, let's actually go to phpMyAdmin. We will check the blacklisted domains table. We have only one domain here. And in the blacklisted emails table, we have 2 blacklisted emails. These all correspond to what we see on the front end here. Let's first delete the blacklisted domain and save our settings. We received a success message, and you see that there are no blacklisted domains here. However, the blacklisted emails are still here. Let's go to phpMyAdmin. Now I will refresh the blacklisted domains table, and indeed it is empty. However, we still have the 2 email addresses in the blacklisted emails table. Now I will delete the 2 email addresses as well from the blacklisted emails table and try to save the settings. We received the success message again, and now we don't have any prohibited emails or blacklisted emails. Let's go to the database. If I refresh the table, you see that there are no blacklisted emails, and of course we still don't have any blacklisted domains. Now I will re-add the blacklisted domain that we had, so this @tests.com, and I will try to save the settings. Again, we have received the success message, and indeed the blacklisted domain is here. And if I refresh the table in the database, indeed the blacklisted domain, the @tests.com domain, has been added to the blacklisted domains table. Now let's re-add the blacklisted emails to the prohibited email addresses field. Notice that the 2 blacklisted emails are separated by a pipe character, so let me save the settings. Let's check the blacklisted emails table. Indeed, now we have the 2 blacklisted emails added to the blacklisted emails table. And actually, let me add a third one. So I have to separate it with a pipe character. It will be mark@tests.com. And I will save the settings. Again, we have received the success message. And if I refresh this table, then we see that a 3rd email address has been added to it, mark@test.com. Let's actually add another prohibited email domain. I have to separate it with a pipe character, and it should be @tests2.com. And I will try to save the settings. And if we go to the database, then we should see 2 blacklisted domains, and indeed the @tests2.com domain has been added to our blacklisted domains table. So fortunately it is working as I described it, and actually this is perfect for our demo application. It's not the most elegant solution that we delete all the domains and emails from the database first, but it is a very simple solution and perfectly suitable for us. Now that we have discussed how the blacklists work, it's time we get back to the subscribe to list method. Let's say all of our validations have passed, so a valid name and an email were provided. The next step is checking if an email marketing provider has been set in the settings table. If, for any reason, there is no email marketing provider selected, then we can't subscribe the user to our mailing list, so we create an array with an error key and associate it with the message that no provider has been set. We encode this associative array as JSON, and of course the error message will be shown to the user. Don't forget that if there is an error property or key in the returned JSON, the second then handler will pick it up and will call the showError function. But we do have Mailchimp selected as an email marketing provider, so let's check the rest of the code. We have an error message variable that is an empty string, and we also have an isSubscribed variable that is set to false. In this if, else branch, we check if the selected provider is a valid one. Don't forget that we have some private variables declared above. One of them contains the string Mailchimp. Because we have selected Mailchimp as an email marketing provider, this first if statement will evaluate to true. We will then call the subscribe to Mailchimp method of the Mailchimp helper class. This is the method where the actual code for subscribing a user to our Mailchimp list is located. We pass the provided name and email to the method and also the error message variable. The subscribe to Mailchimp list method returns true if the user was successfully added to our Mailchimp list. But if it returns false, it means that the user was not added to the list, so we return a JSON string with an error property. This JSON will be assigned to the error message variable. When we pass this variable to the subscribe to Mailchimp list method, it is empty. However, we will save the error message provided by Mailchimp into this variable so that later we can show the user what went wrong. If for any reason the selected provider is not a valid one, so none of our variables above contain the selected provider, then we return with an error that an invalid provider has been selected. This shouldn't really happen in the demo project, but we still have to think about this scenario no matter how unlikely it is. If everything is fine and the subscribe to Mailchimp list method returns true, then we return a JSON with the success property that is associated with the following string: "Thank you for subscribing." So in the welcome.blade.php file, the success property will be found in the second then handler, and we call the show success function to inform the user about the successful subscription. Let's check the subscribe to Mailchimp list method. Let's search for the Mailchimp helper class, so I will press Ctrl P, Mailchimp helper, and indeed here is the subscribe to Mailchimp list method. We've talked about a lot of things so far, but actually everything has been building up to this method. This is where all the code for interacting with Mailchimp is written. First we check if the Mailchimp configs table exists in the database. This is the table where we saved our API key, audience ID, and server prefix. If this table is not available in our database, the method returns false with an error message that the Mailchimp config is not available. Notice that the error message parameter is passed by reference, hence the ampersand symbol before it. This means that whatever value we assign to this variable in the subscribe to Mailchimp list method, it will be available to the calling method as well. When this method returns false, it means that the isSubscribed variable of the subscribe to list method will be false. And in this case, we will return a JSON with an error property. And this error property will contain the error message that we saved into the error message variable in the subscribe to Mailchimp list method. If the Mailchimp configs table is available, we check if there is an API key, a list ID, and a server prefix saved in our database. If any of these three necessary pieces of data is missing, then again we return false from the method, but we save the relevant error message to the error message variable. For example, API key not found. If all the necessary pieces of data are available in the Mailchimp configs table, then we instantiate a new API client object. The backslash at the beginning here means that we refer to the global namespace. And we instantiate the API client object that is located in the Mailchimp marketing namespace. The API client object is not a part of Laravel, so where does it come from and what can we do with it? For the second question, I have a simple answer. We use the API client object to communicate with the Mailchimp API. In other words, we can send requests to the Mailchimp API by using this object. In order to answer the first question, where does this object come from, we have to check the Mailchimp developer documents. Let's navigate to mailchimp.com/developer. Click on Quick Start. Then on the left side, click on Install the client library for your language. Let's choose PHP from the drop-down. You can make calls to the marketing API with whichever method you usually use to make HTTP requests, but Mailchimp offers client libraries that make interacting with the API even simpler. So we don't actually have to use a client library to interact with the Mailchimp API, but there is one available for PHP, and it indeed makes interacting with the API simpler. We can use Composer to install the client library, but of course I have good news for you. I already included this in the composer.json file. So when we set the project up, we automatically installed the client library. This is why it is available in the global namespace. And this is why we can use it so easily in the Mailchimp helper class. Let's go back to the developer documentation and let's click on the link here. We are working with the Marketing API, so let's click on the PHP button here. We are redirected to GitHub, the official code repository of the Mailchimp Marketing API. If you want to know more information about this library, this is the place to do your research. So we have instantiated an API client object, and now we know this object comes from the Mailchimp PHP client library that is included in the demo application. We want to use the API client object to add a user to our audience. But how do we know how to do that? Let's go back to the developer documents. Click on the API reference at the bottom. This part of the documentation tells us what we can do with the Mailchimp Marketing API. We can do a lot of things, but what we want to do specifically is to add a user or an email address to our audience. It's not always easy to find what you're looking for in the API reference here, but I can tell you that we have to click on the list audiences here. And then under the list audiences, we have to click on members. And then we can click on add member to list. This is the part of the documentation that tells us how we can add a member or an email address to our audience or mailing list. We see that we have to make a post request, and we also see a partial URL here, but we don't have to deal with this because we are using the PHP client library. But still, in a moment, we will get back to this partial URL here. Let's click on expand. On the left side, we see the parameters. In other words, the data that we have to send with the request, or the data that we can optionally send with the request. On the right side, we see an example on how to make a request. For now, let's select Bash from the dropdown. We will select PHP a bit later, but first I want to show you the explicit URL where we would need to send a request if we didn't use the PHP client library to make life a bit easier for us. Here we have the following URL. At the beginning, we see DC here. DC stands for data center, and it should correspond to your server prefix. My server prefix is US10, so I would send a request to us10.api.mailchimp.com and so on and so on. We have 3.0 here, which corresponds to the version 3 of the Mailchimp API, and it is the current version. Then we see this part of the URL, this lists until members, and this is what we saw earlier here. Of course, the list ID has to be our audience ID when we make the request. Here, curl stands for client URL. Curl is a tool with which we can make HTTP requests. Later in the course, we will use curl, but not in the Mailchimp section, because it is easier to use the PHP client library. In the last row of this example, we see how data can be sent with the request. For example, there is a key for the email address, there is a key for email type, and so on and so on. We will of course use the PHP client library to send a request, so let's choose PHP from this dropdown. Here is the example on how to instantiate an API client object. We do pretty much the same in the demo application. Then we have to call the setConfig method on the client object, and in an associative array we have to provide our API key and server prefix. We can see that this is what we do in the demo application as well. After calling the setConfig method, then we make a request to the Mailchimp API by first calling lists on the API client object and then the addListMember method. We have to provide the list ID or audience ID to the addListMember method and at least the two required pieces of data, the email address and the status. On the left side, you see that the list ID is required to make the request. A bit lower in the body parameters section, we see that as a bare minimum, we have to provide an email address and a status as well. Of course, in the demo application, we will provide the provided email address, and we will simply set the status to subscribed. You can put the subscriber to a pending status, but in the demo application, once a user is added to the mailing list, we consider the user to be subscribed. Notice that what is returned by the addListMember method is assigned into a variable called response. This, unsurprisingly, will contain the response sent by Mailchimp. Let's see how we do all this in the demo application. We've already discussed how we instantiate an API client object. And we've also seen that we pass our Mailchimp API and server prefix to the setConfig method. So we follow closely the example. We call lists and then addListMember on the client object. We provide our list ID or audience ID here. And of course, we also provide the email address of the user, and we set the status of the user to subscribed. The audience ID, the email address, and the status of the user are the required fields for this request. So these are the required data that we have to send with the request. We, however, provide some additional information, namely the provided name of the user. So we will not only add the email to our mailing list, but also the provided name of the user. You probably have noticed that we send the request inside a try block. We do this to be able to handle any problems that might occur while sending our request. But before continuing with the code, let's check this merge fields key here. And let's discuss why we use this fname key here as well. To understand what these are, we of course have to go back to the developer documentation. I've mentioned that there is optional data that we can send with the request. We see that the email address, the status, and the list ID are the required fields. However, everything else is optional. For example, we could send the language preference or the language of the user and some location data about the user, and so on and so on. But now we are interested in the merge fields parameter here. Let's follow the link here. Each merge field has a type such as address, date, number, or text, which defines how its content will be validated and formatted. For the full list of types and information on how their data is validated, see the table in the Add Merge Data to Contacts section. Basically, we can use merge fields to add some personal data about our subscribers. Let's scroll down to the Add Merge Data to Contacts section. Choose PHP from the drop-down. Here is an example of using the merge fields key or parameter. In the demo application, we simply use the fname key, which stands for first name. But in the demo application, we associate the provided name, the full provided name of the user with this fname key. So in the demo application, we don't require the user to provide their names separately. We also don't have any logic in place for retrieving the first name and the last name from the provided name, so we simply use the fname key to save the user's name in our mailing list. There is no problem with that, but of course, if you want to be more specific with this, you can change the code. As a reference, you can use, of course, the developer documentation. You see here that you can actually save the user's first name in the fname key and the user's last name in the lname key. You can also save the user's birthday actually, or address information, and a lot more. It is up to you how much information you require from your users to subscribe to your mailing list. What is important is that now you see an example on how to send all this information to the Mailchimp API. Let's get back to the code in the demo application. As I've mentioned before, we send the request inside a try block. If everything goes well with the request, then no exception will be thrown, so we will never hit this catch block. In this case, we will simply return true from the method. This means that the user was successfully added to our mailing list, so we will eventually return to the welcome page and show a success message to the user. We will of course see an example for this, but first let's discuss what happens when something goes wrong with the request and the user doesn't get added to the mailing list. If something goes wrong with the try block here, then an exception will be thrown that will be caught by the catch block. Let's check the Mailchimp developer documentation about possible errors. Let's navigate to mailchimp.com/developer/marketing/docs/errors. The Mailchimp Marketing API will return a variety of errors if anything goes wrong with your API calls. Every error has an HTTP status code and will also return an error type and brief explanation when the error is triggered. This documentation provides additional explanations of these errors and guidance on how to avoid them. We will not dig deep in the documentation, but what is important for us is that if there is an error with the request, we should be able to extract it from the response. Let's scroll down a bit. Here is an example of the error Mailchimp sends in JSON format. There is an HTTP status code, but in the demo application we are more interested in the detail property. Whenever we have an error, we should be able to find the detail property, and then we can show the message that is in the detail property to the user so we will know what exactly went wrong. Let's scroll down a bit more. Here is a table about possible errors and explanations for them. For example, if we have a problem with our API key, an HTTP status code of 401 will be returned. We will actually test this a bit later. Let's go back to the code in the demo project. When the Mailchimp API responds with an error, then we should have this exception object available to us. Of course, the exception object will be in this E variable. The exception should have a getResponse method. The getResponse method can actually retrieve the response from the exception object. If the getResponse method does not exist on our exception object, we return false and we provide the error message that something went wrong with the request. But if the getResponse method exists, then we assign the response to the error response variable here by calling the getResponse method on our exception object. We call getBody and then getContents on our error response variable. With these methods, we can extract the response from our exception object in a JSON format. We, however, pass this JSON to the JSON decode method, so we will create a PHP object from this JSON, and we will assign this PHP object to the JSON decoded object variable here. Our object should have a detail property, as we have seen in the developer documentation. When Mailchimp raises an error, it sends information about the error in the detail property, as you can see here in the documentation. If the detail property is missing from our PHP object, then we assume that something went wrong, so we will assign an error message to the error message variable, and of course we will return false. If, however, there is a detail property on our PHP object, then we assign its value to the error message variable. We of course still return false, so once we are in the catch block we will always return false, but this way we can show the exact specific error message to our user on the front end that comes from the Mailchimp API. We have discussed all the relevant code for the Mailchimp integration, so now it's time to test the integration. On my Mailchimp dashboard, we see that I have 0 contacts in my audience. If I refresh the page, we will see that I still have 0 contacts. First, when we test the integration, I want to make sure that Mailchimp will respond with an error and we show this to the user correctly. So I will come to the admin area and update my API key to something totally meaningless. And I will save the settings, of course. Let's go to the welcome page. First, I will not provide anything and I will try to subscribe. Front-end validation kicks in. I have to provide a name. If I try to subscribe now, again, the front-end validation caught that there is no email address, so I will provide an email address. I have an email address here now, so I will try to subscribe. And again, the front-end validation caught that the privacy checkbox is not checked, so I have to check it. And now I will try to subscribe again, and this time all the front-end validations will pass, all the backend validations will pass, and we will send the request to Mailchimp. However, we should receive an error because my API key is invalid. And indeed, this is the message what we see here. Your API key may be invalid or you've attempted to access the wrong data center. This error message actually comes from Mailchimp. Mailchimp responded with an error, so an exception was thrown in our code that we successfully caught. Then we successfully extracted the detail property and showed it on the front end to the user. Let's just quickly walk through the code here. So we send the response here, but an error was thrown and we caught the error. The getResponse method existed on the exception object, so we extracted the response first. Then we extracted the JSON from this error response object, and then we decoded it. So now we have this PHP decoded object. And indeed, there was a detail property on it, and this detail property contains the error message that was sent by the Mailchimp API, and we assign it to the error message variable. And of course, we return false from this method. So we return false from the subscribe to Mailchimp list method. So in the subscribe controller, the isSubscribed variable will be false because we returned false from the method. But don't forget that now the subscribe to list method has the error message available in this error message variable that we passed by reference to the subscribe to Mailchimp list method. So if I scroll down, we see that the isSubscribed is false, so we are returning JSON with an error property. And we associate the error message that was actually sent by the Mailchimp API with this error property. So in the welcome.blade.php file, we can check if there is an error property, and then we can show the error to the user here. So we call the showError function and pass the error message string to it that was returned from the subscribe controller. And of course, the subscribe controller got it from the subscribe to Mailchimp list method. It's time that we finally get rewarded for the hard work we've been doing, so let's actually add a user to our mailing list. My Mailchimp audience still has 0 contacts. First, I will go back to the admin and update my API key so it will be a valid one. And now let's try to subscribe again. I already provided the email there. I will provide a name, I will check the checkbox, and if I click on subscribe now, this fake email address should be added to my audience here. We finally see a success message, so this is definitely a good sign. Now let's go back to my dashboard, let's refresh it and confirm that the email address has been added to the audience. Indeed, this email has been added to the audience, so mark@tmsonic.com. This is what I sent with the request. So we have done a great job. The Mailchimp integration is actually working. So let's go back to the code. So let's go back to the subscribe to Mailchimp list method. We sent a response here in the try block, and because no exception was thrown, so everything went well, then we simply returned true from this method. And in the subscribe controller, because the isSubscribed variable is true, so we returned true from the subscribe to Mailchimp list method. We sent this JSON, so we returned this JSON with the success message that we have seen on the front end here. So this thanks for subscribing a success message. And the JSON that we return, because there are no errors, has a success property. And in the welcome.blade.php file, then we find this success property here in the second line handler, and we call the showSuccess function to show the success message to the user on the front end. There is a lot more we could do with our Mailchimp integration, but for the purposes of the demo application, it's enough that we know how to add users to our audience. If, however, you need to perform some other operations, you now know where to find the Mailchimp developer documentation and how to send a request from your Laravel or PHP project. And now you also know how to deal with errors that might come from the Mailchimp API, so the circle is complete. Earlier in the course I mentioned that the demo application has a feature that makes it possible to add users to our mailing list after they successfully register. We do have a register route, so we have this register form here. The route ends with /register. And on this register form, we can optionally show this subscribe to newsletter checkbox. But we will not discuss the register form in detail now. Let's go back actually to the admin area, so make sure that you are logged in as an admin, and let's click on settings. We can select the marketing service provider here, but we will not change Mailchimp, because we will test with Mailchimp if users are successfully added to our Mailchimp audience upon registration. Basically, there are three options for adding users to our mailing list upon registration. If we select automatic, then the user will be added to the list automatically without any warning. Be very careful about this option because it might not be legal to do this in your location, so only use this option if you're absolutely sure that it doesn't violate the rights of your users. There is a no option, which simply means that the users are never added to our mailing list upon registration. The third available option is the checkbox. This is a very common way to add users to our mailing list upon registration. We ask the users to check a checkbox before we add them to our mailing list. This is of course what we can see on the register page here. If we go with the checkbox option, we can also check the checkbox on the registration page by default. Or we can say that the users themselves must check the checkbox in order to get added to our mailing list. Again, be very careful about automatically checking the checkbox. Depending on your location, you might be required by law not to check the checkbox by default. So the safest option is to leave the checkbox unchecked. I will save the settings now, and I will go back to the register page. Previously, I used the option to check the checkbox by default on the register page, but now if I refresh, then you will see that the checkbox is not checked automatically on the registration page. A bit later, we will register some users and make sure that the functionality works, but before that, let's just quickly talk about the code behind the settings menu. In the admin route group in the web.php file, we have a route that ends with settings and another route that ends with settings/update. The first route is a get route. So when we go to the settings menu on the admin, then we see that the settings method of the settings controller takes care of the request. We also see that the second route is a put route, so when we save the settings here, then we see that the update settings method of the settings controller takes care of the request. Let's search for the settings controller and check the code. Let's find the settings method. It should be at the top. Here it is. In the settings method, we assign the available email marketing providers from the database to the providers variable. We also get the current settings from the database. We assign this to the settings variable. And we also get the subscribing options from the database and assign it to the options variable. These are basically the three options that we have discussed. Not adding any user to the mailing list upon registration, or automatically adding the users to the list upon registration, or adding the users to the list based on the checkbox. We then render the view, so the settings.blade.php file, and we pass important information to it. The current provider variable holds the currently selected email marketing provider. The current option is the currently selected subscribe option. And the current tick variable is a Boolean variable. If it's 1 or true, it means that the checkbox will be checked automatically when the registration page renders. Otherwise, if it's false, then the checkbox will not be checked by default when the registration view renders. Let's find the settings.blade.php file. I will just simply click on follow link here. This Blade file contains a fairly simple form. The form has some logic for preserving the chosen settings if something goes wrong with the update. But earlier in the course we have talked about the old helper actually. So now what is important for us is where this form is submitted, and it is submitted to the admin.settings.update named route. And we already know that this named route is associated with the update settings method of the settings controller, so let's check it out. First, we make sure here that the settings table is available in the database. If it's not available, then we return back with a failure message that the settings table was not found. This should never happen actually, but we have to think about it and deal with it still. If there is no settings table, then we can't save anything into the database, so of course we will not move on here. By the way, in the view, we see that we are checking for a failure message session variable, and if it is set, then we will show failure message to the user, and if a success message session variable is set, then we will show a success message, but we have talked about this earlier already. If the settings are available in the database, then we go on with the validations. the selected email marketing provider, so the email marketing provider here, must be from within this list, so the list that comes from our database. This way, if someone tries to break the system and submit a value outside of our list of available providers, we make sure that the validation fails and nothing will be saved into our database. The same goes for the subscribe option, so for this list, only the values already available in our database pass the validation. For tick subscribed, which is the option for deciding if the checkbox should be checked automatically, we accept a Boolean value. If any of these validations fail, of course, we'll redirect back with a failure message, and this failure message is extracted from our validator. We have already discussed the global helper and the beautify.json method. Basically, by using this method, we make sure that the error messages look good on the front end. If the validation passes, we save the new settings into our database and redirect to the settings route with a success message. Let's do some tests. Let's check if this functionality works as expected. We will test if users can register to the application, and we'll also test if they are added to the mailing list automatically upon registration based on these settings here. First, I will select the automatic option, so I will add the user automatically to the mailing list upon registration. In PHPMyAdmin, we see that now we have 2 registered users, and if I go to my Mailchimp dashboard and refresh it, we will see that I only have 1 contact on my audience. Let's open a register page and try to register a user. So I will try to register automatic at tmsonic.com. The name will be automatic, and the password doesn't really matter here. Now let's see if the user gets registered and if the user gets automatically added to the mailing list, because currently the settings, or according to the settings, the user should be added automatically to the mail list. So let's click on register. Okay, it seems that the user has been added to the application. So let's check the PHPMyAdmin, or a table in PHPMyAdmin in the users table. Now we have a 3rd user. The user is called automatic and the email is automatic@tmsonic.com. Now let's check the Mailchimp dashboard as well. Indeed, the user has been automatically added to my Mailchimp audience. Now let's change the settings. I don't want now users to be automatically added to my Mailchimp audience, so I will save the settings, and let's go back to the register page. So I have to change the route here to /register. And the email address will be no@tmsonic.com. The name can be no, and the password doesn't matter. Let's register the user. So it seems that the registration was successful. If we go to PHPMyAdmin, we should see the 4th user here, and indeed we see the 4th user here. However, if I refresh my Mailchimp dashboard, I should see only 2 contacts. Indeed, I still have 2 contacts, so no@tmsonic.com was not added to my audience as I intended it. Now let's go with the checkbox option, and let's say that we want the checkbox to be selected automatically. So I will save the settings, and let's go back to the registration page. So now the checkbox is checked automatically here. Let's register a new user. So it will be checked at tmsonic.com. I will not uncheck the checkbox, and I will try to register. It seems that the user was successfully added to the users table. Yes, indeed. And we want the user to be added to our audience as well. So let me refresh. We should have 3 contacts now. And indeed, we have 3 contacts. So checked at tmsonic.com was added to our audience. Let's go to the register page again. Now I will register with unchecked at tmsonic.com, and I will uncheck the automatically checked checkbox here. Name will be unchecked, and the password doesn't matter. It seems everything is alright, so let's check the users table. The new user was added to our table, and hopefully it was not added to our Mailchimp audience, so I should see 3 contacts still. And indeed, I see only 3 contacts. The new user was not added to our audience. I will go back to the admin and I will still use the checkbox option, but it will not be automatically checked. Let's go back to the registration page. So now the checkbox is not automatically checked, and actually I will not check this checkbox. So I don't want this user to be added to my mailing list automatically, but this user should be added to the users table in the database. And it seems that this has been successfully done, so let's check the database. Indeed, the user was added to our users table. However, if I refresh my Mailchimp audience or contacts, I still have the 3 contacts, so the unchecked 2@tmsonic.com email was not added to my audience. Now we will test the last option, so we will get back to the register page. I will try to register with a checked 2@tmsonic.com email address. The name could be C2, it's okay. And the password doesn't really matter. But this time I will check the checkbox, so it was not automatically checked, but I will check it myself and I will try to register. It seems that I was registered successfully as usual. So if I refresh the users table, then you see checked 2@tmsonic.com with the name C2 was added to the users table, and we should see this email address as well in my Mailchimp audience. And indeed, this email address was added to my audience, so it seems that all the options we have here work as expected. Let's check the backend that renders the registration view and the code that makes sure that users are automatically added to our mailing list upon registration if we desire to do so. We're using Laravel Fortify for authentication. I've briefly touched upon this, but you can read more about it in the Laravel documentation here. For the demo application, what is important is that we should have a Fortify service provider.php file. Let's search for it. Indeed, it is here. In this file, of course, we have the Fortify service provider class, and this class has a boot method. In the boot method, a bunch of static methods of the Fortify class are called. If we scroll down a bit, we see some static methods that render the views necessary for authentication. For example, the login view method renders the login.blade.php file. However, we are interested in the register view, so we are interested in the register view static method of the Fortify class. By default, this method only renders the register.blade.php file. However, in the demo application, we added some extra code here. We check if the settings table is available, and if it is available, we check if the selected subscribe option is checkboxed or not. If it is, then we will set the show subscribe variable to 1, and we also have a tick subscribe variable. If the checkbox should be checked automatically on rendering the registration page, then this tick subscribe variable will be 1, otherwise it will be 0. We pass these 2 variables to the register view. Let's actually check the register view. Here what is important for us is that we have an if blade directive at the bottom just above the submit button. If the show subscribe variable is true or 1, it means that we have to show the subscribe checkbox on the register view. Moreover, if the tick subscribe variable is also true or 1, then it means that we have to check the checkbox automatically when the register view renders. We've talked about the front end of the registration process, but we still don't know what happens on the back end when we add a user to our mailing list upon registration. In the Fortify service provider.php file, the create users using static method of the Fortify class is called with the create new user class as a parameter. The create new user class takes care of creating new users in the demo application. So if we want to add any custom logic after the user successfully registers, we have to do it in this class. Let's search for it with Ctrl P. And here it is. The class has some private variables that hold the currently available email marketing provider integrations. This should be familiar to you from earlier from the subscribe controller. The class also has a create method. This method creates the new user eventually and adds the user to the database. If we scroll down, we see this at the bottom of this method. The user is created, a name, an email, and a hashed password are saved into the database. But before this happens, so before the new user is created and returned, we validate the provided data. I added some custom logic for the validation. For example, in the demo application, we don't require users to choose a username. We use only the email address of the user to identify the user. I also added the 2 custom rules that we have for the validation. We discussed these earlier in the course. This means that, for example, if a blacklisted email wants to register, the validation will fail, and instead of creating a new user, the registration page will be re-rendered to the user with the appropriate validation errors. So if any of the validations fail here, the create method exits at this validate method call. And the rest of the code here in the create method will never run. Let's actually test this. So let's actually fail a validation during registration. Let's say that we will want to register with a blacklisted email. So let's go back to the admin area and let's check the blacklist. All right, I will try to register with this email address, test@test.com. So let's go back to the register page. I will try to register with this email address. And we should fail the validation. And indeed, we see that we failed the blacklisted email rule and we got back the message, this email address is not allowed. So we have confirmed that once the validations fail here, then we will exit here and the rest of the code will not run. So the new user will not be created. And if we check the database, the users table, we see that no new user has been added to the database, of course. If the validations in the create method pass, then before creating a new user, we will try to add the user to our mailing list if possible. We check if the settings table is available in the database. It should be available, but we still have to check. So if it is available, then this part of the code runs. In this if statement, we check if the selected subscribe option is automatic. If it is, we will try to add the user to our mailing list automatically. If the selected subscribe option is not automatic, but it is checkbox, then we also have to make sure that the checkbox is checked, and in this case we will also try to add the user to our mailing list upon registration. This is the code that will try to add the user to our mailing list automatically upon registration, and this should be familiar to you. By the way, just to avoid confusion, the name of the checkbox is subscribe newsletter, and if it is checked, then the value of this input will be subscribe me. So if the subscribe option is checkbox and both these conditions are true, so if the subscribe newsletter input is a part of the submitted data and the value of it is subscribe me, then we know that the form was submitted with a checkbox and we can try to add the user to our mailing list automatically. The only thing left to do is to use the integration of the selected marketing service provider to try to add the user to the mailing list. So far in the course we have done this only with Mailchimp, so when Mailchimp is the selected provider, then we will use the subscribe to Mailchimp list method to try to add the user to our mailing list or Mailchimp audience. But you see that, for example, if the provider is Sandy, then we will use the subscribe Sandy list method to add the user to our Sandy mailing list automatically. We haven't talked about Sandy, but later in the course, of course, we will talk about this method in detail. What is important now is that we use the same method that we used when the user tried to subscribe to our newsletter from the welcome page. Exactly the same code runs, so we are calling the same subscribe to Mailchimp to list method that we already discussed in the course in detail. However, we don't actually check at registration if the user was subscribed successfully to our mailing list. So we have this is subscribed variable, but we don't check later if it is true or false. This could be changed, of course. We could force the user to retry registering with, for example, another email address. But that would not be a user-friendly approach. It could be very confusing to the user if a registration fails because of an unsuccessful newsletter subscription. If the validations above fail, of course, we must not register the user, but otherwise I don't want to confuse users and scare them from joining the website because something went wrong with the newsletter subscription. They can always try again later. Anyway, if the provided data passes the validations here, then we can be fairly certain that subscribing to the newsletter also works. One last thing to mention is that we already saw that the subscribe to Mailchimp list method returns true if the user was subscribed to the mailing list successfully and returns false if the user was not subscribed to the mailing list successfully. We talked about this in detail earlier in this section of the course. So this is not very interesting, I know, but what I wanted to say that all the methods we have here, so the subscribe send list method or the subscribe to ConvertKit sequence method, they all work the same way, so they will return true if the user was successfully added to the mailing list of the selected provider, and they will return false if the user was not added to the mailing list for any reason. And all the methods actually will also use the error message variable that was passed here as a parameter to save the error message in it. Although we don't really do anything with the error message variable in the create method, and we don't do anything with the isSubscribed variable in the create method as well, they are here for you and feel free to use them if you want to change or extend the code in the demo application for your own projects. So we have successfully integrated Mailchimp into our application. As I've mentioned before, this tutorial is part of a Udemy course. If you want to learn how to integrate more email marketing service providers, such as Sendy, Sendinblue, ConvertKit, and GetResponse, then please purchase my Udemy course. You can find a link to my course in the description of the video. If you have any questions, please leave a comment and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.